Most organizations think HR automation means a chatbot glued to a SharePoint folder full of PDFs. They are wrong. That setup doesn't automate HR, it just speeds up the production of confident nonsense, and it does it without evidence, without controls, and without a defensible decision trail. Meanwhile, the real costs pile up quietly. Screening bias you can't explain, ticket backlogs that never shrink, onboarding that drags for weeks, and audits that turn into archaeology. This episode is about moving from passive HR data to deterministic HR decisions. Not magical thinking, governed use cases, a reproducible stack, and a design that survives contact with compliance, security, and scale. We're going to build 3 workflows: screening, triage, onboarding, using Copilot Studio as the brain and logic apps as muscle, with evidence captured by default. If you're trying to scale HR agents without turning your tenant into a policy crime scene, subscribe to M365 FM. That's the contract here, practical architecture that holds up in production. This episode is a blueprint. Control plane thinking, repeatable patterns you can apply in your own environment. It is not a feature tour, it is not legal advice, and it is definitely not just prompt better dressed up as engineering. We'll walk 3 governed use cases end to end. A candidate screening agent with bias and escalation controls, an HR ticket triage agent designed for measurable deflection, and an onboarding orchestrator that survives long-running state and retries. Now we need to define what an HR agent actually is in system terms. The foundational misunderstanding: HR agents aren't chatbots. The foundational mistake is treating an HR agent like a conversation experience. A chatbot is a user interface. It answers questions. It might search a knowledge base. It might summarize a document. And in most organizations, it lives in the same conceptual bucket as self-service: helpful, optional, low stakes. An HR agent is not that. An HR agent is a distributed decision engine with tool access. That distinction matters because HR work isn't mainly about talking. It's about decisions and actions. Screen or escalate, route or resolve, approve or reject, provision or pause. And the moment an LLM touches those decisions without a controlled action space and an evidence trail, you have converted your HR operations into conditional chaos. Most people try to make the model smarter. But that's the wrong lever. Smarter isn't safer. Smarter just fails in more creative ways. The lever that matters is determinism: what actions are allowed, under which identities, with which inputs, with which guardrails, and with which logs. If the system can't prove what it did and why it did it, it didn't do HR work. It generated text. Here's the uncomfortable truth: HR is where entropy wins by default. Why? Because HR policy is never a single policy. It's a patchwork: regional rules, union constraints, job families, exceptions for executives, accommodations, immigration timelines, and the one-off "we did it this way last time" that never got documented. Every exception is an entropy generator. Every undocumented exception becomes folklore. Over time, policy drifts away from intent. A passive chatbot amplifies that drift. It learns the wrong thing from the wrong artifact, and it presents it with a confident tone. And then humans defer to it because it sounds consistent, and consistency feels like authority. That's how bias creeps in too. Not from bad prompts, from systems behavior. A screening flow that uses unstructured criteria, vague scoring, and inconsistent overrides will converge on proxies. It will favor the attributes that correlate with historical outcomes, not job relevance. If you can't show the rubric, the rationale, and the override reason codes, you can't defend the process. You also can't improve it because you have no instrumentation. So in architectural terms, HR agents are not probabilistic assistants. They are controlled workflow compilers. Copilot Studio should capture intent: what the user is trying to do, what the case context is, what the constraints are, and what the next safe action is. Then it should call tools that execute deterministically. The model can reason, but the tools must enforce. The system must separate decide from do. If you collapse those layers, you get the worst outcome: a probabilistic system taking irreversible actions, and then you retroactively try to explain it. That's not governance, that's storytelling after the fact. This is why the action space matters more than the prompt. Action space is the total set of operations the agent can perform. Read these sources, write these records, send these messages, schedule these meetings, trigger these workflows, and nothing else. And every single action in that space needs 3 things: identity, policy, and telemetry. Identity means the action happens under a real boundary, a managed identity, a service principle, or on behalf of user context, something you can constrain with Entra and conditional access. If the agent can act as whoever, then nobody owns the outcome. Policy means the action has preconditions: confidence thresholds, required approvals, allowed fields, and explicit deny rules. Not please be careful. Real gates. Telemetry means you capture the evidence: what prompt came in, what sources were retrieved, what tool calls were executed, what data changed, who approved overrides, and correlation IDs across the chain. Without that, your audit posture is hope, and HR doesn't get to run on hope. Now, you might be thinking, but we just want to reduce tickets and speed up onboarding. Good, those are exactly the right goals. But to get there, you have to stop building chatbots and start building governed agents, systems where the conversational layer is the control surface and the automation layer is the enforcement mechanism. Once you internalize that, the architecture becomes obvious. Copilot Studio orchestrates, Logic Apps executes, Dataverse holds state, Monitor holds truth. And now we can build something that scales without lying to you. The target architecture, Copilot Studio as brain, Logic Apps as muscle. Here's the target architecture stripped of marketing language. Copilot Studio is the brain, Logic Apps Standard is the muscle. The MCP server is the contract that stops the brain from hallucinating capabilities it shouldn't have. Dataverse is memory with structure. Azure Monitor and Log Analytics are the part nobody wants to pay for right until the first incident. Start with Copilot Studio. Its job isn't answer questions. Its job is intent capture and orchestration. It runs the conversation, asks for missing parameters, and decides which tool call is allowed next based on context. Think of it like a control surface for a workflow compiler. The user describes what they want. The agent translates that into a constrained plan, and then it delegates execution to deterministic tools. That last part matters. Copilot Studio should not be the place where you do HR. It should be the place where you decide what to do next and where you enforce the conversational policy, what information you're allowed to request, what you must disclose, and when you must stop and escalate. This is also where you group actions into governed toolsets. Candidate screening actions are not the same risk profile as ticket triage actions. If you blend them into one giant HR super agent, you've built an Entropy engine. Then Logic Apps Standard. Logic Apps is where actions happen. Calling Microsoft Graph, writing to Dataverse, sending approval emails, routing tickets, generating documents, and triggering downstream systems. And the keyword is standard. For HR, you want the single tenant posture and enterprise controls, managed identities, network isolation, and predictable monitoring. Not because the multi-tenant model is bad, because HR data makes you pay for shared assumptions. Logic Apps Standard also forces a discipline most HR automations never have: explicit workflow boundaries. Each workflow becomes a tool. Each tool has an input schema. Each tool has a permission model. That's exactly what you need if you want a system that behaves deterministically under pressure. Now drop the MCP server into the middle. In the demo research, the MCP server is effectively Logic Apps exposing tools. That's the right mental model. MCP is your tool interface contract. It's how you describe in plain terms what a tool does and what payload it expects, so the model can map natural language into structured calls. But the trick is not the convenience. The trick is that MCP gives you a choke point. You decide which tools exist, how they're named, what parameters they accept, and which identity can invoke them. You stop letting the model invent actions. You force it to choose from a menu you own. Dataverse is next, and it's not optional if you want audit-grade operations. You need structured state, candidate records, screening rubrics, score artifacts, ticket cases, onboarding milestones, approval objects, override reason codes. If the state lives in chat transcripts and email threads, you don't have state. You have vibes. Dataverse also gives you something critical for long-running workflows: durability. Onboarding is not a single request response. It's days of waiting on people, systems, and failures. You need a system of record that survives retries and replays without duplicating actions. Then observability, Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. This is where you capture operational truth across the chain. Not just the agent responded. You need the conversation session ID, the MCP tool call, the Logic App Run ID, the Dataverse transaction, and the outcome. Correlate them, store them, decide retention deliberately. Because without correlation IDs, you cannot answer the only question auditors ask that matters. Show me exactly what happened. Finally, Entra sits across everything as enforcement. The agent is not a person, it's an identity boundary. Managed identity for Logic Apps. Service principal for tool access. Conditional access where appropriate. Least privilege on graph scopes. You don't secure the agent by writing stern instructions in the system prompt. You secure it by making unauthorized actions impossible. That's the architecture. Copilot Studio reasons and routes. MCP defines capability. Logic Apps executes with identity and isolation. Dataverse holds state. Monitor proves behavior. Entra enforces boundaries. Now we can talk about why Logic Apps Standard is the default for HR. Why Logic Apps Standard for HR? Isolation, identity, and auditability. Logic Apps Standard is not a premium option. For HR, it's the baseline if you intend to keep PII inside controllable boundaries and still sleep at night. Most people pick consumption because it's easy, serverless, and it demos well. But HR workflows don't fail in the demo. They fail in production, underload, during audits, after someone forwards a URL, or when a maker copies a workflow into the wrong environment and nobody notices for 6 months. Standard changes the operating model in 3 ways that matter: isolation, identity, and auditability. Start with isolation. HR data has a habit of escaping through convenience. Consumption runs in a shared multi-tenant model. That doesn't mean it's insecure by definition. It means you are accepting shared infrastructure assumptions at the exact moment you're processing resumes, employee records, and hiring decisions that regulators now classify as high risk. You are choosing probabilistic comfort over deterministic control. Standard is single tenant. That changes the blast radius. You get a dedicated runtime you can lock down, and you can move the workflow behind private network boundaries. And yes, that matters. Even if your users sit in teams all day, your agent doesn't care about your user experience. It cares about its scalable endpoints. HR workflows should not be public endpoints with hopes attached. Private endpoints and VNet integration let you make the MCP tool surface non-public by design. You can front it with controlled ingress, you can restrict who can call it, and you can stop pretending that a secret URL parameter is an authentication strategy. Consumption gives you fewer options here. Standard gives you an architecture that can actually be constrained. Now, identity. HR automation fails when everything runs under one shared connection that nobody owns. Standard plays well with managed identities. That means your logic app can authenticate to downstream services without embedding secrets in connection strings and without spreading credentials across environments like confetti. Managed identity isn't a nice to have. It's the only honest answer to who performed this action. Because in HR, the system did it is not an explanation, it's an evasion. With Standard, you can run each workflow as a tool with its own identity posture. You can separate read candidate profile from write scoring artifact from send offer letter and assign different permissions. That's least privilege in practice, not a slide deck. And once you have identity, Entra becomes an enforcement layer instead of a directory. Conditional access can constrain who can invoke what, from where, and under what risk conditions. But it only works if your tool calls have real identities to bind to. Then there's auditability, which is where most agentic HR projects die quietly. If your run history captures PII and you don't configure guardrails, you've built a compliance incident logger. Logic apps will happily store inputs and outputs. That's useful when you're debugging. It's catastrophic when those inputs include candidate resumes, medical accommodation notes, or anything that triggers retention requirements. Standard doesn't magically fix that, but it gives you the enterprise posture to handle it properly. Secure inputs and outputs, controlled storage, and predictable diagnostic routing into log analytics. You choose what evidence you keep, where it lives, and how long it survives. You don't discover your retention policy during an incident review. And here's the unpleasant part. Logic Apps doesn't give you native DLP. That's not a bug, it's the design reality. So you compensate with architecture. You enforce data minimization by design. You avoid putting raw PII into prompts. You pass identifiers, not payloads. You retrieve the sensitive data inside the tool boundary under identity, and you store structured artifacts in Dataverse with explicit access controls. You treat the chat transcript as a control surface, not as a data lake. You also put purview boundaries where they actually apply, on the data sources and repositories that Copilot can retrieve from, and on the storage locations where outputs land. The agent inherits your data hygiene. If your SharePoint permissions are a mess, Copilot will simply surface your mess faster. Standard is also where you get predictable operational telemetry. Consumption will scale, but you're still living inside a model where runs are scattered and visibility can degrade into "we think it happened." Standard makes it easier to treat this like any other production integration workload. Baselines, alerts, diagnostics, correlation IDs, and incident response. So the rule is simple. If the workflow touches candidate screening, onboarding, provisioning, or employee case data, Standard is the default. Not because it's fancy, because it's the only model that lets you enforce isolation, bind identity, and produce audit-grade evidence without duct tape. And once you accept that, the governance layer stops being optional. It becomes the thing that keeps the agent from becoming a shadow admin with good grammar. Governance model, boundaries, roles, and the action space. Governance is not a committee. It's not a PDF. It's not an annual training module everyone clicks through while eating lunch. Governance is the set of constraints that make bad behavior impossible at scale. And in an agentic HR system, the governance unit is not the agent. It's the action space. Action space means the exact set of operations the agent can perform, which tools exist, what parameters they accept, what systems they can touch, and what they can change. Not what it can say, what it can do, because in HR, words are cheap. Actions create liability. This is where most deployments decay. They start with intent, help employees, reduce tickets, speed up hiring, and they end with capability sprawl. Somebody adds one more connector, one more action group, one more exception. Then 6 months later, you have an HR agent that can read too much, write too much, and nobody remembers why. So the governance model starts with boundaries. First boundary, environments. You don't test HR agents in production because you're just trying something. You build in dev, validate in test, and promote to prod with policy parity. Otherwise, you're not shipping an agent, you're shipping drift. Second boundary, tool groups. Candidate screening tools don't live next to onboarding provisioning tools. Ticket triage tools don't live next to offer letter generation. Separation is not bureaucracy. Separation is blast radius management. Third boundary, data surfaces. SharePoint folders full of resumes with random naming and no metadata discipline are not a data source. They're an entropy source. If the agent retrieves from it, it will amplify whatever chaos you stored there. Governance means you curate sources, enforce permissions, and you decide what grounding actually means for HR. Now roles. In most companies, HR automation fails because everyone shares superpowers. The recruiter can change workflows. The maker can publish agents. The platform admin can see everything. Then everyone can do everything. And nobody owns anything. So define roles like the system will punish you if you get them wrong. Recruiters and hiring teams, they should initiate screening workflows, request summaries, and trigger approvals. They should not edit the scoring rubric logic in production. They should not add new tools. They should not bypass gates. HR operations, they own case processes, ticket routing, onboarding milestones, and service delivery metrics. They can tune routing rules and knowledge boundaries. They do not get to expand the action space without review, because just one more connector is how you end up with payroll data in the wrong place. Platform admins, they own environments, identity plumbing, connector governance, and logging. They should not be the people deciding hiring criteria or writing screening rubrics. When the same group controls policy and implementation, exceptions become invisible. And invisible exceptions are how bias becomes a systems feature. Security and compliance, they don't approve the agent here. They approve the action space and the evidence plan. What gets logged, where it's retained, how correlation works, and how fast you can disable pathways when something goes wrong. Now enforce those roles with Entra, not good intentions. Every tool call should bind to an identity boundary. For logic apps, that means managed identities. For agent access, that means explicit permissions and conditional access where it matters. For Copilot Studio actions, it means no, everyone can use this agent default. You publish to audiences deliberately, and you treat broad access as a privileged event. And you build least privilege at the tool level. Read tools and write tools are not the same. Get candidate profiles is not the same as create candidate record. Draft offer letter is not the same as send offer letter. If your action space doesn't separate these, you are relying on the model to self-regulate. It won't, it can't, it doesn't have incentives, it has probabilities. Then there's the part nobody wants but everyone needs, the kill switch. You design every agentic workflow with the assumption that you will disable it, not because you expect failure, but because entropy always finds a path. A kill switch is the ability to shut down tool invocation fast. Disable the logic app workflow, revoke the managed identity permissions, unpublish the agent, or block access via conditional access. Pick at least 2 layers because relying on one control is how outages become incidents. And when you hit the kill switch, you don't fix forward in production. You restore capability only after review. What happened, what evidence exists, what control failed, and what boundary needs tightening. This is the core governance truth. Makers will build, teams will copy, exceptions will accumulate, policies will drift. Your job is to make drift visible, constrainable, and reversible. That's what action-space governance actually is. Compliance hooks without legal theater, oversight, notice, evidence. Most teams hear AI compliance and immediately do one of 2 things. They either panic and stop, or they paste a disclaimer into the chat window and call it governance. Neither works. Compliance in an agentic HR system is not a statement, it's an operating capability, oversight that can intervene, notice that is consistent, and evidence that survives scrutiny. Start with oversight. The laws people reference, NYC Local Law 144 in hiring, Colorado's AI Act for high-risk systems, are not asking you to become a lawyer. They are forcing you to behave like an operator of a decision system, which means you must be able to show who reviewed the outcome, when humans took over, and how the system prevented harm when it was uncertain. That's why human in the loop isn't just a safety net, it's the governance primitive. If your candidate screening agent can score a resume and shortlist a person without a gate, you've effectively built an automated employment decision tool with no supervision story. And the moment a candidate challenges the outcome, your "but the recruiter had final say" argument collapses unless you can prove the recruiter actually did something meaningful. So oversight has to be real, it has to be measurable, it has to leave artifacts. Notice is next, and this is where most teams get weird. They either over-lawyer it and turn the employee experience into a compliance pop-up parade, or they avoid it entirely and hope nobody asks. But notice is not optional in the direction the world is moving. The practical approach is simple. Define when the system is assisting versus influencing. Assisting means it's drafting, summarizing, retrieving policy, or preparing an information package. Influencing means it's scoring, ranking, recommending, routing, or changing access and records. Those are different risk profiles. Treat them differently. When the system influences, you implement consistent user-facing disclosure. In screening, that might be candidate-facing in regulated jurisdictions. In internal HR ops, it might be employee-facing when a ticket is classified and auto-resolved. The point isn't the exact wording. The point is that you can demonstrate you had a repeatable notice mechanism tied to the workflow, not the personality of whoever wrote the prompt. Now, evidence. This is the part everyone promises and nobody actually builds. An auditor does not care that your agent usually does the right thing. They ask for a single case. Show me what happened, end to end, for this candidate on this date under this policy version with this approver and this final outcome. So your evidence model has to be explicit. At minimum, you need 5 things captured and correlated. 1. The user request and the system prompt context that drove the decision, not for performance theater, for accountability. 2. The retrieved sources. If the agent grounded on a SharePoint document, store the document ID, version, and metadata. If it used people data, store what directory attributes it referenced. Otherwise, you can't answer the basic challenge based on what. 3. The tool calls. MCP tool name, input payload, output payload, and the logic app run ID. The system did not decide. It called a tool. Tools leave traces. Capture them. 4. The state transitions in Dataverse. Candidate created, score artifact written, HITL request issued, approval received, override reason code recorded, shortlist updated. These are not chat events. They are business events. 5. The human actions. Who approved, who rejected, who overrode, what reason they gave, and whether they had the right role to do it. And you do all of this with correlation IDs that survive across Copilot Studio, MCP, Logic Apps, and Dataverse. If you can't stitch it together, you don't have evidence. You have scattered logs. A lot of teams worry they're logging too much. Good, that means they finally understand the risk. So be deliberate. Don't dump raw resumes and medical notes into logs. Store references and structured artifacts. Use secure inputs and outputs in workflows so run history doesn't become a data leak. Define retention as a policy decision, not an accident of defaults. Evidence that can't be retained safely is just future liability. And here's the final constraint. Never claim compliance. Claim alignment. You are implementing oversight, notice, and evidence patterns that map to emerging requirements. You're building a system that can be audited, challenged, and improved without rewriting history. That's what compliance hooks actually means in architecture terms. Now we can implement the first concrete control pattern. HITL confidence gates as deterministic stops. HITL pattern, confidence gates as deterministic stops. Human in the loop is not a moral preference. It's an architectural circuit breaker. The point of HITL isn't to make the agent humble. The point is to make irreversible actions impossible when the system's certainty drops below a defined bar. That bar can be a confidence threshold, a risk category, a policy condition, or all three, but it has to be explicit, enforced, and logged. So here's the pattern, confidence gates. A confidence gate is a deterministic stop in an otherwise autonomous workflow. The agent can reason, retrieve, draft, and propose, but if the gate conditions are met, it must pause and request a human decision before any further tool calls that change state. Notice what that does. It converts a probabilistic model output into a controlled workflow step with ownership. Now, teams usually implement this backward. They do HITL when it feels risky. That translates to HITL never until after the incident. You need mechanical triggers. The most obvious trigger is a numeric confidence score. For example, anything below 75 escalates. That doesn't mean the model is measuring truth. It means you're defining a threshold where the system must stop pretending it can decide. And you pick that number by testing, run historical cases, measure how often the agent gets it wrong, and set the gate where the cost of a mistake exceeds the cost of a review. But confidence scores alone are fragile because models can be confidently wrong. So you add policy-based gates. In candidate screening, you gate on incomplete evidence, missing rubric fields, conflicting criteria, or detected proxy risk. In ticket triage, you gate on requests that involve pay, leave disputes, medical accommodations, or anything that triggers an employee relations workflow. In onboarding, you gate on license assignment, group membership, access to sensitive systems, or any action that can create access you can't easily unwind. That's how you build a risk-tiered HITL model without pretending to be a lawyer. Next is the approval object. A HITL pause is useless if it's just ask a human in chat. You need a structured approval artifact that records who approved, what they saw, what decision they made, and why. That artifact lives in Dataverse, not in a Teams message. Teams is the notification channel. Dataverse is the record. So define an approval object with fields that force accountability, case ID, decision type, proposed action, evidence links, confidence score, gate reason, approver identity, timestamp, outcome, override reason code, and a free text justification field, but only after the structured reason code, because otherwise humans will write looks good and call it oversight. What does the approver see? Not the entire chat transcript. That's how you leak data and drown the reviewer. The reviewer gets a context package, the structured rubric, the retrieved sources with links and versions, and the specific recommendation the agent proposes. If the agent can't produce that package, it hasn't earned autonomy. It escalates by default. Now define borderline case like you mean it. A borderline case is not "I'm not sure." It's a set of conditions you can test. Example for screening: candidate meets 70 to 85% of required rubric points or fails one must-have but exceeds in compensating skills, or the job requirement text maps to multiple interpretations. You don't need perfection, you need repeatability. And when a human overrides the agent, approve a borderline candidate, reject a recommended one, that override becomes a signal. It's evidence of drift, bias, or rubric failure. You capture it, aggregate it, and review it monthly. Overrides are not noise. Overrides are where the system tells you it's misaligned with intent. Now here's where most people accidentally kill the value: rubber stamping. If the approval UI makes approve the easy button and reject the annoying one, humans will approve everything and your HITL becomes compliance theater. So you enforce friction, require reason codes on approval and override, require selection of which rubric criterion justified the decision, require a note when the decision contradicts the recommendation, and limit who can approve which actions. Hiring managers approve shortlist additions. HR ops approves policy exceptions. Platform admins approve tool expansion. Nobody approves everything. Finally, treat HITL as a stop, not a detour. When the system pauses, it should freeze the workflow state and wait. No parallel tool calls, no keep going and we'll review later. If you let actions proceed, you didn't implement HITL, you implemented a notification. So the payoff is simple: autonomy where mistakes are reversible, friction where mistakes are irreversible, and a decision trail that survives scrutiny because it's made of records, not stories. Now we prove it: observability and audit evidence across prompts, actions, overrides, and state. Observability and audit evidence, prompts, actions, overrides, and state. If you remember nothing else from this episode, remember this: an HR agent without observability is just a liability generator with a chat window, because the failure mode isn't the agent answered wrong. The failure mode is the agent acted and you can't reconstruct why. And in HR, reconstruction is not a technical hobby, it's your defensibility story. So what does audit-grade observability actually mean in an agentic workflow? It means you can produce a complete chain of evidence for any case, from the original user intent, to the sources retrieved, to the tools invoked, to the data that changed, to the human approvals and overrides that allowed it to proceed. Not we have some logs, a chain. Start with prompts and context. You need to capture the user's input plus the relevant system instructions that shape the agent's behavior at that moment. Not because you love storing chat transcripts, because when someone challenges an outcome, the first question is always, what did the user ask and what did the system assume? But don't get sloppy. Prompts can contain PII, so you don't default to raw dumps. You store what's necessary for reconstruction and you redact what creates unnecessary exposure. This is where secure inputs and outputs in logic apps stop being a checkbox and start being a survival feature. Next, retrieval evidence. If the agent grounded its response or decision on SharePoint resumes, policy documents, or people directory data, you must store the references, not just the generated text. That means document IDs, version IDs, and metadata that lets you prove what the agent saw. Otherwise, you get into the worst kind of argument. The policy changed after the decision, and you can't prove it didn't. Now, tool calls. Your model doesn't do onboarding. It calls a tool that provisions accounts. Your model doesn't route tickets. It calls a tool that assigns a case. Those tool calls are where reality happens. So log each tool call with tool name, input payload shape, output summary, and the execution identifiers from your downstream platform. In our stack, that means correlating Copilot Studio session identifiers to MCP tool invocations, to Logic App Run IDs, to Dataverse transaction IDs. Correlation IDs aren't a nice to have. They are the only way you can stitch a conversation to an action. Now let's talk about overrides, because overrides are where most teams accidentally delete their own credibility. A human override must be treated as a first-class event, not a footnote. Store who overrode what they overrode, the reason code, and the justification. And crucially, store whether the override contradicted the agent recommendation or simply confirmed it. Why? Because override rates are how you detect drift. A rising override rate means the rubric is failing, the knowledge sources are stale, or the agent is routing edge cases badly. A near zero override rate might mean the agent is perfect, or it might mean humans are rubber stamping. You don't get to assume which one. You instrument it, then state. The system needs a durable case record that captures progression over time, candidate screening from intake to shortlist, ticket triage from submission to resolution, onboarding from offer accepted to day 30 milestones. Chat transcripts don't model state. They model conversation. Dataverse models state, case objects, milestones, approvals, and artifacts that survive retries, restarts, and long-running waits. That's what makes your workflows deterministic at scale, because your agent doesn't need to remember. It can read current state and act accordingly. Now, retention. Logs aren't free. They aren't free operationally, and they definitely aren't free legally. Decide retention deliberately. What evidence must be retained, where it lives, and for how long. Tie it to your HR and compliance policies. Don't accidentally retain sensitive prompts forever because nobody set a policy and the default was keep everything. Then the metrics that expose failure. Track escalation rate, HITL trigger rate, override frequency, unresolved sessions, and reopen rates for tickets. In screening, track borderline volume and decision variance across reviewers. In onboarding, track retry counts and idempotency violations, because provisioned twice is not an error you want to discover in an audit. And yes, track latency, because slow agents cause humans to bypass them, and bypass is the real enemy. The point of all of this is audit readiness as an operational posture. When someone asks what happened, you don't go digging. You produce the record on demand. And once you can do that, you can scale the agent without losing control because the system tells you what it's doing, where it's drifting, and where humans are compensating for design omissions. Now we can apply this control plane to the 3 use cases without changing the architecture every time. Use case map, 3 workflows, 1 control plane. Now the 3 use cases, not because they're the only HR automations worth doing, but because they represent 3 different failure modes. High-risk decisions, high-volume operations, and long-running orchestration. And the point is that the control plane stays the same. Candidate screening is the volatile one. It's bias-sensitive, it's legally sensitive, and it's where people most want to let the model just decide because the volume is painful. That's exactly why it fails first. So the control plane here is strict, structured rubric, constrained tool calls, HITL gates on borderline scores, and an evidence trail that links the score artifact to the exact resume source version. The agent can summarize and propose. It can't silently rank and move on. Screening is where you prove your agent isn't an automated discrimination machine with good UX. Ticket triage is the safer, higher ROI starter. It's operationally ugly, but it's not usually irreversible. If the agent misroutes a ticket, you can correct it. If it auto-resolves a tier 1 request with the wrong answer, you can reopen it, fix the response, and improve the knowledge boundary. That makes it ideal for scaling early, because you can instrument deflection without gambling on high-stakes decisions. And yes, this is where measurable reductions like the ticket volume drop happen, not from smarter language, but from deterministic classification, routing, and scripted resolution paths that don't require 3 humans to touch the same case. Onboarding orchestration is the one that exposes whether you actually built an agentic workflow system or just a chat layer with some connectors. Because onboarding isn't one flow. It's a sequence of dependent actions across days, accounts, groups, licenses, equipment requests, training assignments, manager check-ins, and exceptions that arrive late and break assumptions. This is where state idempotency and retries stop being theoretical. If you can't survive a connector timeout without double provisioning a new hire, you haven't automated onboarding. You've created a denial of service against your own identity platform. So those are the 3. Now here's what ties them together. The event, reasoning, orchestration, evidence pattern. Every workflow starts with an event. In screening, it's a resume intake or a recruiter request to shortlist. In triage, it's a ticket submission through Teams, email, or a portal. In onboarding, it's an offer accepted signal from your ATS or HRIS. The event creates a case record in Dataverse. That case ID becomes your spine. No case, no control. Then reasoning. Copilot Studio takes the event, asks for missing parameters, applies the conversational policy, and chooses the next allowed tool. Reasoning does not mean free-form thinking. It means selecting from constrained options. If the agent can't bind the request to a known rubric, a known routing map, or a known onboarding stage, it escalates, because unknown state is where models improvise. Improvisation is not an HR strategy. Then orchestration. Logic apps executes the tools: parse, classify, route, provision, notify, request approval. Each workflow is a tool. Each tool has a schema. Each tool runs under an identity boundary. This is where you enforce the difference between read and write operations, and where you front-load safety, validate inputs, enforce preconditions, and stop on gates. The model doesn't get to try things. It gets to invoke permitted operations, or it gets blocked. And finally, evidence. Every tool call, state transition, approval, and override writes an audit trail, correlation IDs across Copilot session, MCP invocation, logic app run, and Dataverse records. That's how you survive audits and incident reviews without inventing a narrative. The common misunderstanding is thinking these are 3 separate builds. They're not. They're 3 applications of the same control plane with different risk tolerances. And we start with candidate screening because it's the one that punishes weak governance immediately. Use case 1. Candidate screening, intake to shortlist. Candidate screening is where people quietly give the model too much authority because the volume feels unbearable. And then they act surprised when they can't defend outcomes. So the first rule in this workflow is simple. Resumes are not documents. They are regulated data objects. Treat them like objects. Resume intake starts in SharePoint, but not in a folder named Resumes Final 2. You need metadata discipline, requisition ID, role family, region, submission date, source channel, and a stable candidate identifier. The reason is not organization. The reason is retrieval control. If Copilot can retrieve from everything, it will. And you've just turned your whole tenant into an unreviewed training set for your screening logic. So the tool boundary is the agent never pulls all resumes. It calls a logic apps tool that queries SharePoint by metadata filters and returns a bounded set of candidates and references. References, not payloads. You don't pipe raw resumes through the chat layer. You return candidate IDs, file links, and extracted structured fields if you've done parsing inside the tool boundary. Next is criteria parsing, and this is where most teams sabotage themselves. They take a job description, throw it into the model, and ask for a score out of 10. That's not screening, that's astrology with better typography. Instead, you translate job requirements into a structured rubric, must-haves, should-haves, and disqualifiers. Each rubric item has a label, a weight, and a required evidence type. Evidence type matters because it forces specificity. Years of experience in X, certification Y, experience with tool Z, portfolio link, clearance level, whatever is job-related. If it can't be expressed as a rubric item, it doesn't belong in automated scoring. That's how you keep the system from drifting into proxies. Now, bias-filtered scoring. This is not about pretending the system is moral. It's about preventing the system from using irrelevant correlates. Resumes contain proxy landmines. Names, graduation years, addresses, gaps, extracurriculars. Some of these are legitimate signals in specific contexts. Many are not, so you do a two-stage scoring pattern. Stage 1. Redact or ignore obvious proxy fields before scoring. The agent doesn't need names to assess skills. It doesn't need addresses to assess qualifications. It doesn't need a graduation year to assess role fit. If you want location for relocation eligibility, that's a separate explicit field, not whatever the resume implies. Stage 2, require rationale per rubric item, not a narrative essay. A structured statement, which excerpt or evidence supported the score, linked back to the source reference. That gives you explainability without turning the workflow into a philosophy seminar. And because you're not trusting vibes, you store the scoring artifact in Dataverse. Candidate ID, requisition ID, rubric version, per item scores, rationale pointers, and a final recommendation status. That artifact is the output. The chat response is just the UI. Now here's where most people mess up, borderline cases. They either escalate everything, which kills throughput, or they escalate nothing, which kills defensibility. So define borderline explicitly. A practical definition is candidates that land in a scoring band where small rubric interpretation differences change the outcome, or candidates missing one must-have but exceeding strongly in multiple should-haves. Your rubric can label these conditions. The workflow can detect them deterministically. Then you apply the confidence gate. If the workflow meets borderline conditions, or the model confidence falls below your threshold, the agent stops and generates a review package, not the chat transcript. A package, rubric results, evidence links, and the proposed decision. Then HITL triggers. In the demo research, the hiring manager approval happens via email. That's fine as a channel, as long as the approval becomes a record. The approval object in Dataverse captures approver identity, decision, timestamp, and reason code. If the manager overrides the recommendation, they must choose why. Not because you want to punish them, because you want to measure drift and prevent rubber stamping. Once approved, the agent can trigger the next actions. Schedule an interview, generate interview questions, or move the candidate to the next stage. Again, those actions should be tools. Invite candidate is a tool. Create questions is a tool. Update status is a tool. Each one has an input schema and a permission boundary. And the audit entry is automatic. Every time a candidate gets scored, escalated, approved, or rejected, you write an evidence record. Correlation IDs from Copilot session to MCP tool call to logic app run to Dataverse transaction. This is the difference between explainability and storytelling. If someone asks, why did we reject this candidate? You don't answer with a paragraph. You answer with a record. So the outcome of this workflow is not a shortlist. The outcome is a shortlist you can defend. Bias, fairness, and explainability. What you can actually defend. Bias doesn't show up as an evil line of code. It shows up as a system choosing shortcuts. And hiring systems love shortcuts because the data is messy and the pressure is high and everyone wants the queue to disappear. The thing most people miss is that bias is usually a proxy problem, not a prompt problem. The model rarely uses race, and it uses variables that correlate with race. Zip codes, school names, employment gaps, graduation years, even certain role titles that are historically skewed by demographic patterns. If you let unstructured text drive scoring, the system will learn these correlations faster than you can write a policy memo about them. And yes, it also shows up as drift. Your rubric starts clean. Then a recruiter adds an exception. Then a hiring manager insists we need culture fit. Then someone adds a field for communication style. Then a new region uses different signals. Over time, the scoring criteria stops being job-related and starts being an organizational mirror of whatever bias already exists. So what can you actually defend? You can defend repeatable criteria tied to the job. You can defend consistent treatment across candidates. You can defend oversight with recorded rationale. And you can defend monitoring that detects when the system starts behaving differently than intended. You cannot defend vibes. Start with structured scoring. The rubric is your defensibility artifact. It doesn't need to be perfect, it needs to be explicit. Must-haves, should-haves, disqualifiers, and weights. And every score has to bind to evidence, not the model thinks. Evidence. An excerpt reference, a portfolio link, a certification, a documented project, something you can point at later without rerunning the model and getting a different answer. That alone knocks out a large class of bias because it forces the system to operate on job-related signals instead of socially correlated noise. Now test outcomes, not intentions. A practical method here is disparate impact screening. The simplest lens people use is the 80% rule as a quick check. Compare selection rates across groups and flag when one group's rate drops below 80% of the highest group's rate. It's not a legal conclusion, it's a smoke alarm. If it triggers, you investigate the rubric, the data, the workflow, and the human overrides. You also run counterfactual checks. This clicked for a lot of teams when they realized you can change one attribute that shouldn't matter and see if the score shifts. Swap a name, remove a graduation year, replace an address with a neutral placeholder. If the scoring moves materially, you just found a proxy pathway. That doesn't mean the system is racist. It means your design allowed correlated inputs to influence outcomes. Then consistency verification. Take a sample of resumes and score them across rubric versions and across reviewers. If small wording changes in the job description cause large ranking shifts, your rubric is underspecified. If different reviewers override in opposite directions with no consistent reason codes, your human oversight is theater. And if override rate is near zero, assume deference, not perfection, because the human factor is brutal. When you put an AI recommendation next to a human in a busy workflow, you create authority bias. People defer, they rubber stamp. That's why you require reason codes and justification on overrides and approvals. Not because it's fun, because it forces cognitive engagement and it gives you signals you can measure. Now, explainability. Explainability is not the model's chain of thought. Now, don't store it, don't rely on it, and don't pretend it's the rationale. Explainability is what rubric items drove the outcome, what evidence supported each item, what sources were used, and what human interventions changed the path. That's it. If the agent can produce that, you can defend the process as a controlled decision workflow. If it can't, it's just generating text and hoping the audience trusts it. And vendor reality, responsibility stays with the deployer. Even if the resume passing comes from a third party, even if the scoring model is industry standard, you own the outcome because you operationalized it. Contracts don't absorb liability, they just spread blame, and blame is not a control. So the defensible posture is a cycle. Structured rubric, proxy minimization, outcome monitoring, and periodic sampling reviews, not annual panic, a rhythm. And once you have that rhythm, you can safely move to the lower risk, higher ROI deployment pattern, HR ticket triage. Use case 2, HR ticket triage, deflection without chaos. Ticket triage is where most HR teams actually bleed time. Not because the questions are hard, because the intake is messy, the routing is emotional, and the same request gets touched by 3 people before anyone decides who owns it. So the goal here isn't build a helpful HR chatbot. The goal is deterministic deflection. The system takes a request, classifies it into a lane you control, resolves what it can safely resolve, and escalates the rest with an evidence package. Start with intake. You need one entry point, even if you accept many channels. Teams message, form, portal, email, fine. But every pathway must normalize into a case object. A single schema. Ticket ID, requester identity, category candidates, region, urgency, and whatever minimal context you allow. If you don't normalize, you can't measure. If you can't measure, you can't scale. Copilot Studio then does what it's actually good at. It runs the conversation to fill missing parameters and prevent garbage in. If the user writes benefits, the agent asks 1 clarifying question, not 6. If it's time off, it asks jurisdiction. If it's payroll, it asks pay period. This is where you reduce entropy before you automate. Then classification. Most teams create a general HR bucket because it feels flexible. It isn't. It's where triage goes to die. Instead, you map topics to tool groups and lanes. Benefits questions go to benefits knowledge and benefits workflows. Time off requests go to leave policies and leave tools. Payroll issues go to payroll routing and a higher default HITL profile. Employee relations items get flagged as high sensitivity and routed to humans by design. The agent shouldn't be allowed to improvise categories. It chooses from the set you own, and it must attach a confidence score and a rationale for the classification. Once you nail that, everything else clicks. Routing becomes deterministic. Logic Apps takes the classified case and applies routing rules. Queue assignment by category and region. Priority rules for specific keywords or metadata. SLA timers, escalation targets. And here's the key. The routing is not AI magic. It's a mapping table you can review. If the agent predicts category A, the workflow routes to QA. If category is uncertain or the case hits a risk trigger, the workflow routes to a human triage queue with a clear reason code. Tier 1 auto-resolution is where you get the ROI, and it's also where people accidentally create chaos. Auto-resolution doesn't mean the model writes a confident paragraph and closes the ticket. It means use grounded knowledge plus deterministic actions where allowed. Reset a password, that's an IT flow, not HR, but you get the idea. Update an address, that might be a controlled HRS write with approvals. Where do I find the policy? That's a link plus the policy version reference. How many leave days do I have? That's a read operation that returns a number, not a hallucinated answer. So the play is simple. For Tier 1 categories, your agent can do two things. Provide an answer grounded in approved knowledge sources, and execute a bounded action through a tool when the action is low risk and reversible. Anything else pauses. This is where the HITL pattern becomes operational, not philosophical. Complex cases don't get escalated by dumping chat history into an email. They get escalated with a context package, the normalized case object classification confidence, the knowledge sources consulted, the proposed next action, and the exact reason it couldn't auto-resolve. That package gets written to Dataverse and routed to HR Ops, so the human starts with structure, not archaeology. Now, the uncomfortable truth. Triage will expose your knowledge boundaries fast. If your knowledge base contains outdated policies, the agent will confidently cite them. If your SharePoint permissions are sloppy, the agent will surface sensitive content to the wrong people. If your categories are vague, the agent will route unpredictably. And if your workflows can't log safely, you'll end up with PII sitting in run history like a self-inflicted breach. So you treat ticket triage as a controlled system, bounded inputs, bounded tool calls, bounded outputs, and full evidence. You measure it with metrics that matter. Deflection rate versus resolution rate, escalation rate, reopen rate, and human touches per case. And you review overrides, when humans reclassify, when they reopen, when they change the lane. Those are drift signals. Fix the mapping, tighten the knowledge scope, or add a gate. That's how you get deflection without chaos. Not by trusting the model, by enforcing the workflow, measuring ticket reduction, what actually drives the 44%. When someone claims, we reduced HR tickets by 44%, the first job is to ask what they mean by reduced, because there are two numbers that get confused on purpose: deflection and resolution. Deflection means the employee never created a ticket, or the ticket never reached a human queue. Resolution means a ticket existed and eventually got closed. You can inflate one while the other quietly gets worse. If the agent answers in chat and employees still open tickets because they don't trust it, you didn't reduce anything. You just added a new front door to the same backlog. So the measurement model needs to start with a strict funnel. Intake volume, normalized cases created, cases routed to a human lane, cases auto-resolved, cases reopened, cases escalated, and then the one metric that exposes operational truth, human touches per case. If your AI triage still requires two humans to read, interpret, and forward the same request, you just replaced manual work with slower manual work. Now, what actually drives a ticket reduction claim in a system like this? It's not the language model being smarter. It's three levers: classification quality, knowledge boundaries, and action capability. Classification quality comes first because it determines everything downstream. If the agent can reliably map requests into a small set of well-owned lanes, you stop burning time on triage ping-pong. You also reduce rework because the right team gets the case the first time. This is where you measure precision, not vibes. How often did the initial category match the final category after human review? How often did it hit the right queue? How often did the agent ask for one clarifying parameter instead of dumping the request into other? Knowledge boundaries come next. People love to talk about RAG like it's a strategy. It isn't. RAG is a retrieval mechanism. The strategy is what sources are allowed, how they're filtered, and how they're versioned. If the agent can only ground answers in curated HR policy sources, by region, by employee type, by current effective date, you reduce the number of tickets created for where is the policy and what's the process questions. But if it retrieves from random SharePoint sites, you increase tickets because employees will immediately escalate when they see conflicting answers. That's not an AI problem. That's your information architecture showing up in public. Action capability is the third lever, and it's the one that creates real deflection. Not answers, actions. When the agent can complete a bounded low-risk task, submit a request, update a field, create a case with the right metadata, route it correctly, employees stop opening tickets as a workaround. This is also why logic apps and MCP tools matter. They turn chat into completion. Now here's where most people mess up the measurement. They report automation rate using the agent's activity logs, which mostly measure sessions. Sessions don't equal outcomes. You want outcome metrics that punish bad automation. So track deflection rate as percentage of intents that end without a human ticket touch. Track auto-resolve rate as percentage of cases closed with no human intervention. Track escalation rate as percentage that hit HITL gates or high-risk categories. Track reopen rate as percentage reopened within a defined window. Track satisfaction separately. because low satisfaction with high deflection is just silent failure. And then track the failure signals that predict collapse. If escalations rise week over week, classification is drifting or knowledge is stale. If satisfaction drops while deflection rises, employees are getting wrong answers but giving up. If retries and repeat questions increase, the agent is not completing tasks, it's looping. And if override frequency is near zero, you probably trained humans to defer, which means you're accumulating risk, not reducing workload. When you connect those metrics back to design choices, the story becomes boring. Good. Boring means deterministic. Confidence gates reduce wasted human time by routing only edge cases. Deterministic routing rules reduce triage ping-pong. Knowledge scoping reduces conflicting guidance. Scripted Tier 1 actions eliminate "please forward this to" workflows. The 44% is not magic. It's what happens when you stop treating HR support as a conversation and start treating it as a controlled system. And if you can't measure it with those levers, you don't have a reduction. You have marketing. Use case 3, intelligent onboarding. Offer accepted to day 30. Onboarding is where most agents go to die, because onboarding is not a question and answer problem. It's a long-running orchestration problem with dependencies, delays, and irreversible side effects. And the trigger matters. If your onboarding starts because someone posted new hire starting Monday in Teams, you don't have an onboarding workflow. You have a ritual. The trigger needs to be an actual event. Offer accepted in your ATS, a row created in your HRS, a status change in a hiring system. Something durable, something you can replay, something you can audit. That event creates a case record in Dataverse with a day timestamp, owner, region, role family, and a staged checklist. From there, Copilot Studio does the conversational work. It fills in the missing parameters without turning onboarding into a form. Start date, manager, location, equipment needs, any conditional paths like contractor versus employee, and any regional policy flags that change what standard onboarding even means. Then it hands execution to logic apps through MCP tools. And this is where you stop being cute and start being reliable. First, provisioning via Microsoft Graph, account creation, group membership, license assignment, mailbox provisioning, Teams enablement, whatever your org does. The architectural point is not that Graph exists. The point is that these are write operations with blast radius. So they are gated, idempotent, and least privilege. Provision identity is not one tool. It's a tool group with separation. One tool to create the account, one tool to assign baseline groups, one tool to request elevated access, one tool to validate the final state. Each tool runs under a managed identity with scoped permissions. No shared connections, no HR automation service account. That quietly becomes the most privileged identity in the tenant. And yes, you put approvals where the damage is expensive. Assigning a standard M365 license might be auto. Assigning access to finance systems or HR systems should not be. That's a HITL gate by risk category, not by feelings. Second, training assignments. Most organizations handle this with an email and hope. That's not onboarding, that's outsourcing accountability to Outlook. So the agent creates structured training tasks, role-based learning paths, compliance modules, and deadlines. It stores each assignment as a stateful milestone in Dataverse. Assigned, due date, completion status, evidence link. The completion signal can come from your LMS connector, a file submission, or a simple acknowledgement flow, but it must update state, not just send reminders. Because if you can't query who is behind on onboarding milestones, you don't have an onboarding system, you have noise. Third, scheduling check-ins. This is where agents look impressive in demos and disappointing in reality. Scheduling isn't hard. Scheduling with constraints is hard. So you treat check-ins as tasks, not calendar magic. The agent creates a manager task. Schedule day 7 check-in, schedule day 30 review, confirm equipment received, confirm access works. If you can automate calendar invites through Graph, fine. But the system still tracks completion as state, because calendar invites do not equal completed onboarding. And now the part people get wrong, adaptive nudges. This is not surveillance. It is not monitor their team's messages. You don't need psychometrics. You need basic workflow signals, training incomplete, no check-in scheduled, provisioning failed, equipment ticket unresolved. Those are objective indicators that onboarding is drifting. So the agent watches milestone state. If a milestone is late, it nudges the owner, the manager, HR ops, IT onboarding, whoever owns that step. And it nudges with context, what's missing, what tool call failed, what the next action is. Not, hey, just checking in. That's how you create notification fatigue and then everyone turns it off. Now, the reason this use case matters is that it exposes orchestration reality. Provisioning actions can't run twice without causing damage. Training assignments can't get duplicated because the employee changes managers. Check-ins can't be best effort if you want consistent time to productivity. So the workflow must be durable across days. It must survive connector timeouts. It must resume after human approvals. It must log every state transition. And it must be able to answer at any time, what stage is this person in? What has been done? what is blocked, and who owns the block. That's what offer accepted to day 30 actually means. Not a chatbot that says welcome to the company, a governed system that turns onboarding into a deterministic sequence of actions with evidence. And if you can do that, you've proven the platform can handle the worst kind of HR automation, long-running, cross-system, and full of edge cases. Now we deal with the uncomfortable mechanics that make it survive: state, retries, idempotency, and drift. Orchestration. Reality. Reliability patterns for agentic HR. Now it gets unglamorous. Onboarding, ticket routing, and screening workflows don't fail because the model hallucinates. They fail because distributed systems behave like distributed systems: partial failure, duplicate events, timeouts, retries, and human delays. And the moment you let an LLM sit on top of that without hard reliability patterns, you've built a probabilistic control plane for deterministic work. So start with idempotency, because HR workflows love doing the same damage twice. Provisioning is the obvious example. If create user runs twice, you don't get two users, you get a mess. Conflicting objects, partial licenses, inconsistent group membership, and cleanup work that becomes a shadow project. The fix is not be careful. The fix is to design every right tool to be idempotent by default. Accept a stable key, check current state first, and only apply deltas. That stable key should be something like a candidate ID, employee ID, or a composite key you control, not whatever name came from the resume. Names are not identifiers, they're noise. So each tool call needs a precondition check. Does the record already exist? Is it in the expected state? And is this transition allowed? If the answer is no, you stop and escalate. The agent doesn't improvise close enough state transitions. It can't see the consequences. Next is retries and dead lettering. Retries are not reliability. Retries are how you turn transient failures into duplicate side effects. That's why you pair retries with idempotency and why you distinguish transient errors from business rule failures. A connector timeout, retry with backoff. A 429 throttle, retry with backoff and jitter. A validation failure like manager ID missing or region policy mismatch. Don't retry. Create a deterministic failure state, route to HITL, and wait for human input. And when retries finally give up, you need a dead letter path. Not send an email to the builder. An actual queue or case state that says, this workflow instance is blocked, here's the error, here's the context package, and here's who owns the fix. HR doesn't need heroics, it needs predictable recovery. Now here's where most people mess up the architecture. They couple protocol to processing. They build HTTP request response flows that do heavy work inline because the demo looks clean. But HR work isn't always fast and it's rarely reliable end-to-end. So split it. Use request response only to acknowledge receipt and create the durable case record. Then push the heavy work into asynchronous processing, queues, long-running orchestrations, and stepwise state transitions. That's how you avoid timeouts, how you absorb spikes, and how you stop the client from becoming the reliability boundary. And yes, HR has spikes. Monday mornings, open enrollment, new hire waves, policy changes. The system doesn't care that your workload is seasonal. It will fail anyway. Design for it. Tool throttles and connector limits are the other silent killer. Every connector has quotas, latency variation, and failure modes that show up only when you scale. Your demo will work. Your production run will hit rate limits and stall mid-process, leaving partially completed onboarding or half-routed tickets. So you need explicit throttling strategy. Limit concurrency, batch where appropriate, and prefer event-driven triggers over constant polling when the source supports it. Where it doesn't, you still design for duplicate events because polling will deliver them. Now, state ownership. Copilot Studio is not a system of record. The chat history is not a system of record. Logic app run history is not a system of record. Dataverse is your durable workflow state. The case, the milestones, the approval objects, the artifacts, the correlation IDs. That means every long-running workflow reads state before acting, writes state after acting, and treats state transitions as the source of truth. If the agent restarts, it doesn't remember. It rehydrates from Dataverse and continues. That's what makes it survivable. And finally, drift. The workflow you built today is not the workflow you'll run in 6 months. Someone will change a rubric. Someone will add a ticket category. Someone will update onboarding steps. Entropy accumulates. So make drift explicit. Version your rubrics, version your tool schemas, and store the version used on every case record. If you can't say this decision used rubric v3, you can't explain behavior changes without rewriting history. Reliability in agentic HR is not uptime. It's controlled repetition, safe retries, safe duplicates, safe delays, and recoverable failure. Without that, your agent doesn't scale, it just fails faster. Reproducible blueprint, build order and guardrails. Now the build plan. Not a journey, a sequence that produces working outcomes with guardrails that stop you from creating a clever prototype that collapses the first time HR hits a busy Monday. Start with build order and accept the risk gradient. Ticket triage goes first. It's high volume, mostly reversible, and it forces you to build the control plane, case normalization, deterministic routing, knowledge boundaries, and HITL for sensitive categories. If your stack can't survive triage, it won't survive hiring. Onboarding goes second. It teaches durability, long-running state, retries without double provisioning, approval waits, and the unpleasant reality that connectors fail more often in production than in demos. If you can't do idempotency and state ownership here, you're not ready to let the agent touch identity. Candidate screening goes last, not because it's hard technically, but because it's hard operationally. It's where bias and explainability get externalized into audits, complaints, and litigation risk. You build it after you already know your logging, gating, and identity boundaries work. Now, environment model. If you build in one environment and publish to prod by exporting a zip file, you don't have an architecture. You have a hobby. You need dev, test, and prod with policy parity. Same connectors, same network constraints, same key vault patterns, same logging settings, different data, same controls. That's the only way you stop "it worked in my tenant" from becoming your post-incident slogan. And yes, that includes Copilot Studio environments and Power Platform governance, not just Azure. Agents drift when environments drift. You want drift to be intentional, versioned, and reviewed. Identity model next, because this is where HR agents quietly become security debt. Every workflow tool gets its own managed identity, not one identity for HR automation, not one shared connection that accumulates privileges over time. Per tool, per workflow, scoped permissions. And where you need user context, you use on behalf of patterns deliberately, not accidentally. Then you separate roles across the human side: recruiters, HR ops, and platform admins. Recruiters can initiate and review. HR ops can approve policy exceptions. Platform admins can expand tool access. Nobody gets the combined power to change the toolset and approve the outcomes. That's not governance. That's a future incident with a single name on it. Now, data model. This is where teams sabotage themselves by stuffing PII into prompts because it's convenient. Don't. Minimal PII in prompts. Use IDs and retrieval with permissions. The agent should reason over structured fields and reference documents, not raw resumes and medical notes pasted into a chat window. In practice, that means Dataverse holds case, state, and structured artifacts, rubric scores, ticket categories, onboarding milestones, approval objects, and evidence links. SharePoint holds documents with metadata. Logic Apps tools retrieve what's needed when it's needed under an identity boundary. The chat layer stays thin. Guardrails come next. The non-negotiables that prevent capability sprawl. 1. Define the action space upfront. List the allowed tools, the allowed operations, and the prohibited actions. Can read policies is not the same as can update HRIS records. Can schedule interviews is not the same as can generate and send offer letters without review. If you don't define action space, the agent will expand it through requests, exceptions, and maker creativity. Entropy always wins. 2. Implement confidence gates and risk gates as defaults. Low confidence classification routes to humans. High risk categories route to humans. Any right to identity or access routes through approvals. You don't negotiate this in production. You implement it as the system's behavior. 3. Observability is mandatory before scale. Correlation IDs across Copilot, MCP, Logic Apps, and Dataverse. Secure inputs and outputs where PII exists. Retention as a policy decision. If you can't reconstruct a case end to end, you don't scale, you stop. And now governance rhythm, because governance is not a document, it's a calendar. Monthly. Review KPIs that expose failure, not vanity adoption metrics. Escalation rates, override frequency, reopen rates, unresolved sessions, and latency. Quarterly. Sample decisions for fairness and consistency in screening, and run outcome checks where you have the data to do it. And always, incident playbooks that include a kill switch. Disable tools fast. Restore after review. That's how you prevent a bad change from becoming a month-long cleanup. If you implement this blueprint, you get something rare, an HR agent system that behaves like an enterprise system, deterministic where it must be, probabilistic only where humans can correct it, governed by design, not by hope. ROI and KPIs, the only numbers that matter. Now the numbers, not because spreadsheets are fun, but because agentic HR without measurement becomes a budget line item with no defensibility. And the numbers that matter aren't the ones vendors put on slides. They're the ones that tie directly to throughput, risk, and human time. Start with ROI components. In this architecture, value comes from 3 places: fewer human touches per case, faster cycle times, and fewer exception loops. Ticket triage drives the first one, onboarding drives the second, candidate screening drives the third, but only if you treat it as structured scoring plus review, not an automated decision engine. Then cost components. Licensing is the obvious line, but it's never the dominant cost in production. Build effort matters, but it's one time. Governance and monitoring are the ongoing costs people forget to price in. Log analytics retention, audit evidence storage, quarterly sampling, bias checks, and incident response practice. If you don't fund those, you aren't saving money. you're deferring it into a compliance event. So the model is simple. Value is reclaimed hours times loaded cost plus any measurable reduction in external spend like agency costs or contractor triage support, plus any cycle time improvement that has a business impact. Costs are licenses, build, run, and governance overhead. Nothing else counts. Here's the math framing you can actually use. Pick one workflow, measure baseline, then measure after. For ticket triage, average handle time per ticket, total ticket volume, % auto-resolved, and reopen rate. If you reduce human touches, you reclaim hours. If you reduce reopen rate, you reduce second pass work. If you reduce time to first response, you reduce escalations and executive noise. That's ROI without fantasy. For onboarding, measure time from offer accepted to day one ready, plus the number of provisioning failures per hire, plus the number of manual follow-ups required to complete milestones. If you cut missed access and reduce rework, new hires become productive sooner. That's the only onboarding ROI that matters. Time to productivity, not number of welcome emails sent. For candidate screening, measure screening time per candidate, percentage of borderline escalations, and reviewer variance. If your structured rubric cuts screening time while increasing consistency, you get measurable savings and a defensibility upgrade. If it just moves work into review the AI's score, you didn't automate anything. You added a new step. Now KPIs. Keep them ruthless. For ticket triage, deflection rate, auto-resolve %, time to first response, reopen rate, escalation rate, and human touches per case. Track override frequency too because it tells you when classification is drifting or when the knowledge boundary is wrong. For onboarding, % of hires, day one ready, provisioning retry counts, idempotency violations, milestone completion times, and number of late milestones per hire. Late milestones are the real indicator of systemic failure because they correlate with manager frustration and new hire churn. For screening, rubric completion rate, borderline rate, approval turnaround time, override rate by reviewer, and consistency across rubric versions. And you need at least one fairness signal, not a legal conclusion, a monitoring indicator that tells you selection rates changed materially when we changed rubric V2 to V3. If you can't detect that, you can't claim you're managing bias. Finally, the executive narrative. Scale doesn't come from smarter AI. Scale comes from fewer exceptions. Every exception is an entropy generator, a one-off rule, a manual override, a hidden permission, a side channel. Your agent gets better when your system gets tighter. That's the uncomfortable truth behind every successful deployment. So when someone asks, what's the ROI? The answer is not the model is amazing. The answer is we reduced human touches, shortened cycle times, and made high-risk decisions auditable by design. So that's the transformation. Governed agentic workflows turn HR from a reactive queue into a controlled system that can actually scale. Here's the challenge. Next week, pick one workflow you already have pain around. Ticket triage is usually the best start. Add one confidence gate that forces a human decision when risk crosses your line. And add one evidence record in Dataverse that lets you reconstruct what happened without digging through chats. If you want more blueprints like this, Copilot Studio as the brain, logic apps, standard as the muscle, and governance as the control plane. Subscribe to the M365 FM podcast. And if you've got a real HR agent failure mode you want dissected, connect with Mirko Peters on LinkedIn and send it.